Hi, my name is Maree Aldwinckle, and I am a casual academic staff member and a Masters of Research student at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. And I'm here to talk to you about critical reflection. But before I do that, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I study and teach, the Aldwinckle clan of the Darug Nation. I also wish to pay my respects to the custodians of the land where I live, the Darug people. Finally, I would like to recognise the numerous First Nations people across our world, many of whom are still struggling for respect, recognition and economic independence. I may occasionally look away from the screen or the camera, and I apologise if that's a bit disconcerting, but I am recording this from my quarantine hotel room in Ecuador, in Quito, Ecuador. So my setup is not normally as it would be, so I apologise for that. So how did I arrive at the topic of reflective practice and critical reflection as the point of research? I've been involved in early childhood for many, many years, over 40 years, and quite a large proportion of the time I have been involved in teaching pre-service educators and pre-service teachers. For at least 11 years, I was directly involved in teaching reflective practice and critical reflection. In all of this time, I came to the conclusion that generally speaking, educators and teachers in early childhood services and just people generally are really bad at critical reflection and really bad at reflective practice. So that was my point of entry. If we look at the research around why educators and teachers can be so bad at reflective practice, a number of things come up. One of the first things that comes up is time. Good, effective, practical, useful, reflective practice takes time. And when we're working in early childhood services, we have very little effective time to engage in critical reflection or reflective practice. We are on the run daily. It also depends on the context. In Australia, we have two primary sources of centre-based early childhood care. One is long day care and the other is preschool. Long day care services operate for 12 hours a day, usually 48 weeks of the year, and cater for children 0 to 6 for working and studying parents. Preschools operate from 9 o'clock to 3 o'clock, or sometimes even have half-day sessions. They operate only during school terms, and they cater for children aged 2 to 5. So it's not surprising when we look at the statistics around time and services that we find that preschools can engage in reflective practice more readily and more effectively than educators in long day care services. One of the other things that crops up, one of the other barriers, if you like, to critical reflection, reflective practice is the effort that it takes. If we apply, oops, sorry about that, something's just come up on my phone, which I should have had on silent. When we apply Bloom's taxonomy to critical reflection in particular, we find that it has it's at the top of the tree in terms of cognitive load and cognitive functioning. So it's quite a drain on our cognitive resources to engage in critical reflection. It is also quite emotionally and psychologically draining because we are engaged in self-criticism and self-analysis, okay, often in a group situation, and that can be quite confronting for any of us. Perhaps the one that comes up the most for me when I'm talking to other educators and teachers in early childhood services is just confusion around the concepts. I often get asked, Maree, can you tell me the difference between reflective practice and critical reflection? Or if I bring the topic up, the comment will often be, Maree, no one knows the difference between them. So in practice, it seems to be an issue. And it's not surprising when we consider that there are multiple constraints, multiple constructs or definitions surrounding reflective practice and critical reflection. We're all pretty familiar with Donald Scon's ideas of reflection on practice and reflection in practice. And in fact, it's probably Mr. Scone who is responsible for the current obsession around critical reflection, not just in early childhood and not just in education, but in a number of professions. But we have so many other models and so many other definitions and so many other ways and means of engaging in reflection. Now, just to give you a few, we've got Kolbe's learning cycle, Honey and Mumford's learning styles, the ERC cycle, Driscoll's model of reflective practice, Gibbs' reflective cycle, general mindfulness, technical reflection, and practical reflection. And that's just to name a few of the reflective processes, concepts, and ideas that I've come across in my research. To add to matters, the complex requirements regarding how reflective practice and critical reflection should be used in the early childhood services as a pedagogical tool is just extraordinary. I'm going to look at what happens in the Australian context to give you a bit of a taste of that a bit later. And the final thing that I'd like to look at and identify as a bit of a barrier and something that we should be considering is lack of training or types of training. So when we look at the readings and the research around reflective practice and critical reflection, one of the big things that often crops up is this idea that, yes, people aren't so good at it, but with training and intervention, we can improve them. All right, perhaps we can, perhaps we can't. We'll discuss that a bit more in a minute. So before I dive into more of an analysis of the Australian situation, I'm just going to give you a little bit of background to our critical reflection and national quality standards here. So the idea of critical reflection in particular was embedded in our early childhood pedagogy when we had a significant review of our national quality framework in 2012. So to be deemed meeting the new national quality standards, all educational staff in services must now engage in critical reflection on children's learning and development. this is one of the standards. Now, this national policy review was stimulated by that constant global recognition and emphasis being put on the importance of the early years. Most of you would have experienced similar sorts of consequences in your own locations and countries. So this was spearheaded by the OECD, pushing the importance of the early years, and also as a result of that, the idea that we should professionalise the sector more and provide and promote the professional recognition of educators. In 2018 in Australia, critical reflection became an essential theme across all 7 areas of our National Quality Framework, which includes 40 quality standards altogether. So if a service wants to achieve the highest rating, which is exceeding national quality standards, it must show that it has critically reflected across all 7 quality areas and all 40 quality standards. Currently, more than 10% of Australian early childhood services fail to meet the simple condition, I shouldn't say it's simple, the condition to demonstrate critical reflection, and are deemed as working towards meeting the quality standard. 10% of services are not judged as engaging in critical reflection on children's learning and development. So let's investigate this a little bit further from the Australian context. We're going to have a look at 2 documents, or the information in 2 main documents. The first document is the Early Years Framework, and the second document is the National Quality Framework. The Early Years Learning Framework was published in 2009 and is undergoing review as we speak to be republished and in a revised edition next year. It'll be very interesting to see what it says. The Early Years Learning Framework is our curriculum framework document. It is a framework, it is not a specific curriculum or syllabus. The National Quality Framework is the entire framework, including the National Quality Standards. And the document we're looking at here is the National Quality Framework Guide, which is quite a lengthy tome, which gives lots of instruction to people in early childhood services about how to meet the legislative, regulatory and quality requirements. Okay. So the Early Years Learning Framework has a number of principles, practices and learning outcomes, and one of those principles is ongoing learning and reflective practice. It mentions critical reflection twice in its 51 pages, so that's at a rate of 4 in 100 if you like, and it provides a couple of definitions of critical reflection. So within the document itself, it says, critical reflection involves closely examining all aspects of events and experiences from different perspectives. Lovely, simple. In the glossary, however, it extends on this and it says, critical reflection are reflective practices that focus on implications for equity and social justice. So we've taken a broad process and it's now focusing on equity and social justice. Let's look at the National Quality Framework. Critical reflection is embedded in element 1.3.2. Critical reflection on children's learning and development, both as individuals and in groups, drives program planning and implementation. Fair enough. There are several definitions and lots of mentions of critical reflection throughout this document. And in fact, it's mentioned 60 times in this 636-page document, which is at the rate of 9 in every 100 pages. It mentions reflection many more times than that, and sometimes it appears to use critical reflection and reflective practice interchangeably, which is confusing as well. Now, one of the definitions, or the first clear sort of definition that is mentioned in this guide, is very similar to the Early Years Learning Framework. It says, critical reflection involves closely examining all aspects of events and experiences from different perspectives, but it has an added coda with a focus on implications for equity, inclusion and diversity. So now we've gone from equity and social justice to equity, inclusion and diversity. The glossary definition in the National Quality Framework is the same as the glossary definition in the Early Years Learning Framework, I might point out. Further examination shows that the National Quality Framework Guide outlines 12 aspects of the program that should be analysed and describes 17 ways to demonstrate critical reflection. Now let's just rethink this. The element says critical reflection on children's learning and development. It doesn't mention equity and social justice. It mentions children's learning and development. So my position, sorry, I'll just go back to that previous slide. It's not going to let me do that, so I'll just talk. The ambiguity that's created by these different definitions and requirements, and multiple requirements, is contributing to confusion and the struggle that Australian educators and teachers in early childhood services are having in trying to enact critical reflection in practice. So we not only have the range of barriers that were mentioned at the beginning, but we have this complexity created by the discussions within the documents themselves that just don't add up. Okay, so the final thing that I want to talk about, and I'm going to be very quick because I think I've gone over time already, is the fact that we have multidisciplinary teams. Not all In Australia, we have multidisciplinary teams, and not all of these people with different qualifications are well prepared for critical reflection. I'll leave it at that because of time. So my final conclusions are, in relation to the question, is critical reflection necessary for quality in early childhood services? My conclusions at this point are, reflective practice in its many forms improves professional practice. Therefore, reflective practice in early childhood services should improve the pedagogical practice of educators and teachers. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. And as a consequence, outcomes for children and families are improved. However, there is a scarcity of evidence that critical reflection improves professional practice more than any other form of reflection. For scarcity, read none as far as I'm concerned. I've been researching and looking for 12 months. There is evidence that critical reflection is arduous, time-consuming, confusing and stressful for educators and teachers in early childhood services. And the argument for critical reflection appears to be purely theoretical and is possibly elitist. My final word, prioritising critical reflection devalues other forms of reflection and fails to acknowledge that it may not be the wisest or most practical strategy in all circumstances. I hope my preliminary research in this area has given you some food for thought, as it has given me, and thank you for listening.